Russia just placed 400 intelligence operatives inside Burkina Faso's military command. Not advisors, operatives. France, after 60 years of unbroken control, has been expelled from 3 countries simultaneously. And here's what nobody's telling you. This isn't about terrorism. It's about something far bigger. A new power bloc is forming in the heart of Africa. One that operates outside Western rules, rejects colonial currency, and just signed a gold deal that changes everything. China's building the infrastructure. Russia's supplying the weapons. And the West? They're watching their entire system collapse in real time. What happens next will determine whether Africa breaks free or just changes masters. Because this isn't a regional story anymore. This is the beginning of a global shift. And it's happening right now. A French military convoy crosses the border out of Niger for the last time. No ceremony, no speeches, just silence and dust. After more than 6 decades of uninterrupted presence across the Sahel, France has been forced out, not by a single rebel faction or a rogue coup leader, but by 3 governments acting in lockstep. Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have severed military, economic, and diplomatic ties with Paris, and they did it together. This isn't political theater. This is the deliberate dismantling of one of the last pillars of Francafrique. For decades, France maintained influence across West Africa through a layered system. Currency control via the CFA franc, defense agreements that allowed Paris to station troops on sovereign soil, and economic arrangements that funneled resources toward French multinational firms. The Sahel was the cornerstone of this architecture. French forces were positioned as essential to regional stability, deployed under the banner of counter-terrorism operations like Barkhane and Serval. But the arrangement was never equal. Host nations paid for French military presence through political compliance, resource access, and economic dependence. Paris shaped cabinet appointments, vetoed security partnerships, and retained veto power over monetary policy through the CFA framework. That model is now collapsing. The shift began in Mali. In 2022, the military junta expelled French forces and invited Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group to fill the vacuum. Paris called it reckless. Bamako called it sovereignty. Then Burkina Faso followed. Another coup, another expulsion, another pivot toward Moscow. But when Niger, long considered France's most stable ally in the region, joined the exodus in 2023, the pattern became undeniable. These weren't isolated decisions. They were part of a coordinated recalibration. The 3 nations formalized their alignment through the Alliance of Sahel States, a mutual defense pact that effectively replaces French security guarantees with intra-regional cooperation. They began pooling intelligence, coordinating border operations, and negotiating new partnerships with Russia, Turkey, and China. The message was clear. The Sahel will no longer outsource its security to a former colonial power. This realignment has profound implications. France loses more than military bases. It loses privileged access to uranium from Niger, which powers a significant portion of its nuclear grid. It loses influence over who controls transit routes for goods moving between the Sahara and the Gulf of Guinea. It loses the ability to shape security doctrines in a region where jihadist insurgencies continue to expand. And perhaps most critically, it loses the perception of indispensability. For decades, French presidents framed their interventions as acts of partnership, even generosity. That narrative no longer holds. But this isn't simply about kicking out the French. It's about what comes next. The Alliance of Sahel States is betting that regional autonomy, combined with selective partnerships outside the West, can deliver better outcomes than dependency ever did. Yet the risks are enormous. Jihadist violence has escalated, not diminished, since French forces began withdrawing. Civilian casualties are rising. Governance remains fragile. And the new partners, Russia in particular, bring their own forms of leverage and exploitation. Wagner's presence in Mali has been linked to extrajudicial killings and resource extraction schemes that mirror the very dynamics these governments claim to reject. So the question isn't whether France's influence is ending. It already has. The question is whether the Sahel can fill the vacuum it's created without descending into deeper instability, and whether this realignment represents genuine sovereignty or simply the replacement of one external patron with another. What happens in the next 2 years will determine whether this moment is remembered as a turning point towards self-determination or the beginning of a more volatile era. The region is watching. So, is the rest of the continent? Because if 3 nations can break free from a system that has defined them since independence, others will ask why they can't do the same. Russia has deployed over 400 intelligence operatives into Burkina Faso. Not advisors, not observers, operatives. They're embedded directly within Captain Ibrahim Traoré's military command structure, training officers in counterintelligence, urban warfare tactics, and internal security protocols. This isn't consultation. This is integration. And it marks the most significant Russian security footprint in West Africa since the Cold War. Moscow isn't just filling a vacuum left by France, it's building a new model of influence, one that trades military protection for strategic access. And the Sahel is proving to be fertile ground. The pivot began with Mali, where Wagner Group mercenaries arrived in 2021 to bolster a fragile junta facing jihadist insurgencies and public unrest. But Burkina Faso represents something more calculated. Traore, who seized power in 2022, has positioned himself as a Pan-Africanist firebrand, openly rejecting Western security frameworks and calling for African-led solutions. Russia saw an opportunity. Within months of Traore consolidating power, Russian military personnel began arriving in Ouagadougou. They weren't there to fight on the front lines. They were there to reshape how Burkina Faso's military operates from the inside. Intelligence gathering, surveillance infrastructure, loyalty enforcement, the kind of capacity building that doesn't just win battles, it secures regimes. But this relationship isn't purely transactional on Moscow's terms. Burkina Faso extracted something Paris never offered: resource sovereignty. In a move that sent shockwaves through global mining markets, Russia and Burkina Faso signed a gold mining agreement that grants Ouagadougou majority profit control. Not revenue sharing, not licensing fees, majority control. Under the deal, Burkina Faso retains over 60% of profits from Russian-operated gold extraction, with revenues earmarked for infrastructure, education, and defense spending. It's a stark departure from the colonial-era contracts that allowed foreign firms, many of them French or Canadian, to extract billions in gold while host governments received a fraction of the value. Russia, whether out of genuine partnership or strategic necessity, structured the deal to look like economic justice. And in a region where anti-colonial sentiment is surging, optics matter. This is where the stakes become clear. Russia isn't replicating the French model. It's inverting it. Paris maintained influence through dependency, loans, military bases, and currency control that kept former colonies tethered to European decision-making. Moscow is offering something that feels like autonomy: security without strings, resource deals that favor the host nation, and rhetorical alignment with sovereignty and self-determination. Whether that autonomy is real remains to be seen. Wagner's record in the Central African Republic and Mali suggests that Russian security partnerships often come with their own forms of exploitation: extrajudicial violence, resource smuggling, and political manipulation. But in the short term, the perception is working. Traore can point to tangible gains: a military that's better trained, a treasury that's better funded, and a foreign partner that doesn't lecture him about democracy or human rights. The broader implications extend far beyond Burkina Faso. If Russia can successfully position itself as the preferred security partner for post-colonial African states, offering military capacity, resource equity, and political cover, it fundamentally alters the balance of power across the continent. France loses not just influence, but relevance. The United States, which has long relied on counterterrorism partnerships to justify its presence in the Sahel, finds itself sidelined. And China, despite its massive infrastructure investments, doesn't offer the kind of hard security guarantees that unstable regimes desperately need. Russia does. And it's doing so at a time when African governments are increasingly willing to gamble on alternatives to Western patronage. But here's the strategic uncertainty. Can Russia sustain this? Moscow is stretched thin. Its war in Ukraine drains resources, manpower, and political capital. Wagner's operations in Africa have been chaotic, brutal, and increasingly difficult to manage after the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin. And the financial returns from gold and other extractives may not justify the costs of maintaining a sprawling security presence across multiple fragile states. What happens if Russia overextends? Does the alliance of Sahel states collapse back into instability, or does it pivot again, this time toward China, Turkey, or an entirely new constellation of partners? The answer will determine whether this moment represents a genuine shift in African agency or just the latest chapter in a long history of external powers competing for control. Russia has delivered advanced air defense systems, armored personnel carriers, and combat helicopters to the alliance of Sahel states. No loans, no conditional aid packages, no strings attached. This isn't military assistance in the traditional sense. It's a strategic deterrent. And the message is aimed directly at Paris. If France or any Western coalition even considers re-intervening in the Sahel, they'll now face a military equipped not with aging Soviet-era hardware, but with modern Russian weaponry capable of contesting air superiority and inflicting significant casualties. The cost of intervention just went up, and Moscow made sure of it. This marks a fundamental shift in how external powers engage with Africa. For decades, Western military aid came with conditions: governance reforms, human rights benchmarks, alignment with international coalitions. Russia offers no such requirements. The equipment arrives, the training begins, and the only expectation is loyalty. For governments like those in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, regimes born from coups, isolated diplomatically, and desperate for legitimacy, this model is appealing. They get the tools to consolidate power without the lectures. And in a region where jihadist insurgencies continue to expand and popular frustration with insecurity runs high, the ability to project military strength is existential. Russia understands this. It's not just arming the Sahel. It's making these governments dependent on Russian supply chains, maintenance contracts, and technical expertise. Once that infrastructure is embedded, reversing course becomes nearly impossible. But military hardware alone doesn't build nations. That's where China enters the equation. While Russia secures the Sahel militarily, Beijing is financing its economic transformation. Chinese state-owned enterprises are pouring billions into infrastructure projects across the region. Highways linking landlocked capitals to coastal trade routes, energy grids powered by solar farms and hydroelectric dams, telecommunications networks that will define digital connectivity for the next generation. These aren't vanity projects. They're foundational investments that position China as the indispensable economic partner for a bloc that's attempting to decouple from Western financial systems. And here's where the strategy becomes clear. Russia and China aren't competing in the Sahel, they're dividing labor. Moscow provides the security guarantees that keep these governments in power and deter external threats. Beijing provides the long-term capital that builds industrial capacity, creates jobs, and generates the kind of economic growth that can legitimize authoritarian rule. Together, they're offering a package that neither the United States nor Europe can match: military protection without political conditions, and development financing without austerity measures or governance reforms. It's a model built for regimes that prioritize sovereignty and stability over democracy and transparency. And in the Sahel, that model is winning. China's approach is particularly calculated. Unlike Western development banks, which tie loans to structural adjustment programs and environmental standards, Chinese financing is flexible, fast, and focused on tangible infrastructure. A port gets built. A road gets paved. Power lines go up. The political returns are immediate and visible. And while critics point to debt trap dynamics in other regions, Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, Zambia's copper mines, the Sahel is betting that the benefits outweigh the risks. For governments that have spent decades watching resource wealth flow out of their borders while infrastructure crumbles, the Chinese offer feels like a rare opportunity to build something permanent. But this is where the stakes become clear. If Russia and China succeed in establishing a durable security and economic framework in the Sahel, they don't just displace France. They create a blueprint for challenging Western influence across the entire continent. Other African nations will take note. If the alliance of Sahel states can achieve stability, economic growth, and genuine sovereignty outside the traditional Western orbit, then the post-colonial order that has defined the continent for 60 years begins to fracture, and the geopolitical center of gravity shifts east. Yet the risks are immense. Russian security partnerships have a track record of violence, exploitation, and instability. Chinese infrastructure projects often leave host nations with unsustainable debt and limited local employment. And the alliance of Sahel states is still fragile, facing internal insurgencies, economic shocks, and the constant threat of coups within coups. The question isn't whether this model looks good on paper. The question is whether it can survive contact with reality. Because if it fails, the Sahel doesn't just return to French influence. It descends into a deeper, more chaotic vacuum. And that outcome serves no one. 3 countries in the Sahel have built what no African coalition has managed in decades: a functioning military and economic bloc capable of operating independently of the West. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger didn't just expel French forces. They replaced them. They didn't just reject Western economic models. They created alternatives. And now, the alliance of Sahel states is being watched across the continent not as an isolated experiment, but as a potential blueprint. If this works, if these governments can maintain security, deliver growth, and retain sovereignty without Western support, the entire architecture of post-colonial influence in Africa begins to crack. The timing matters. Across the continent, frustration with Western engagement has reached a tipping point. Decades of structural adjustment programs failed to deliver prosperity. Counter-terrorism partnerships didn't stop the spread of extremism. And promises of partnership were repeatedly undermined by interventions that prioritized Western interests over African stability. The Sahel bloc is betting that a different model is possible. One where security comes from Russia, development financing from China, and political alignment from a shared rejection of external dominance. It's not Pan-Africanism in the idealistic sense. It's pragmatic sovereignty, and it's resonating. Other African governments are paying attention. In Central Africa, leaders facing similar security crises are reconsidering their relationships with former colonial powers. In East Africa, nations tired of conditional aid are exploring alternatives. Even in West Africa, ECOWAS, the regional bloc that once threatened military intervention to restore democratic rule in Niger, internal divisions have emerged over how to respond to this new alignment. Some member states want to isolate the Sahel bloc. Others see opportunity. The fracture is real, and it reflects a broader continental debate about what independence actually means in the 21st century. This is where the stakes become clear. If the alliance of Sahel states succeeds, it doesn't just shift regional power. It accelerates a continental realignment. African nations will increasingly see multipolarity not as a theoretical concept, but as a viable alternative. They'll ask why they should accept IMF austerity when China offers infrastructure loans without governance conditions. They'll question why they should host U.S. military bases when Russia provides security without demanding democratic reforms. And they'll wonder why they should remain within French monetary zones when digital currencies and bilateral trade agreements offer more flexibility. The dominoes don't all fall at once, but each one that tips makes the next one easier. Yet the model being built in the Sahel is far from proven. Russia's security presence has been chaotic and brutal. Wagner mercenaries have been implicated in civilian massacres, resource smuggling, and destabilization tactics that mirror the exploitation they claim to oppose. China's infrastructure projects have saddled other African nations with unsustainable debt, and there's little evidence that the Sahel will be any different. And the alliance itself remains fragile. Jihadist violence is escalating, not declining. Governance is authoritarian and brittle. Public support for military juntas is conditional on their ability to deliver security and prosperity, neither of which is guaranteed. So the question isn't whether this bloc represents a break from the past. It clearly does. The question is whether it represents something better or just different, and whether the promise of sovereignty can survive the reality of dependence on new patrons who may be just as extractive as the old ones. What happens in the next 3 years will determine the answer. If the Sahel stabilizes, builds functioning economies, and maintains autonomy, this model will spread. If it collapses into deeper violence, debt crises, or authoritarian overreach, it will serve as a cautionary tale. Either way, the implications extend far beyond 3 landlocked countries in West Africa. Because this isn't just about the Sahel. It's about whether the post-colonial order that has governed Africa for 60 years can hold, or whether the continent is entering a new era where power, influence, and alignment are no longer dictated by Washington, Paris, or Brussels, but negotiated by African governments willing to gamble on alternatives. The rest of the world is watching, and the outcome will reshape more than Africa. It will reshape how the entire global South engages with the remnants of Western hegemony. That's what makes this moment so consequential. The Sahel isn't just breaking away. It's showing others how.